Following a developing story out of the White House, the Trump administration reportedly in talks to some of the world's biggest semiconductor companies to build new chip factories here in the United States. Let's get to Kayla Tausche with more details. Kayla.
Melissa, these talks have been going on between the federal government and these tech companies for several years, predating the Trump administration, but they've taken on new urgency because of the supply chain disruptions that have been wrought by the coronavirus. The Wall Street Journal reporting that Intel has joined talks with the federal government and Taiwan Semiconductors to build microchip foundries here in the U.S., with Intel CEO Bob Swan personally writing a letter to the Pentagon, which has reached Capitol Hill, saying that that company has the capability to do this here. Taiwan Semiconductor has said there's been no decision yet, but the key question is how the government can incentivize companies to do this business here, where it's much more expensive to do it. In October, when the New York Times reported on some of these efforts, the chairman of Taiwan Semiconductor said it is all up to when we can close the cost gap. Now, to be sure, this is just one silo that the National Security Council has opened to secure products related to national security, medical supplies, defense equipment, pharmaceuticals, and yes, semiconductors. To do this in 2017, a council advising President Obama then suggested, Melissa, that the government set up a sort of venture capital fund to co-invest alongside these companies to offset some of these costs. That's something that was again floated by the Semiconductor Industry Association, but the conversation continues.
All right. Kayla, thank you. Kayla Tausche. Let's bring in Jefferies tech specialist Jared Weisfeld. Jared, great to have you with us.
Hey, Melissa, how are you? Thanks for having me.
From Intel's perspective, let's say, since Bob Swan is the one who wrote that letter, why do you want to be invested in by the U.S. government? I would think that it has its pluses and minuses.
So just taking a step back, I think the bigger issue is that the entire semiconductor supply chain, and I think this is what the Department of Defense and this is what the administration is focused on, there's basically a single point of failure in the system right now because there's an over-reliance on Taiwan Semiconductor based in Taiwan, whereby if you think of some of the U.S.'s largest manufacturers of chips, whether it's Xilinx or NVIDIA or AMD, they leverage Taiwan Semiconductor out in Taiwan. So to the extent that anything were to ever happen from a supply chain disruption perspective, it certainly brings risk to the table. And I think all of that was or has been accelerated in the context of national security when you look at some of the recent developments that have occurred and the recent tensions between the U.S. and China. I think using national security as a catalyst certainly makes a lot of sense to start thinking about bringing some of these plants back here in the U.S.
But obviously, as the Semiconductor Industry Association pointed out, it's all about the costs, right? They're over in Asia for a reason. So how can the government actually close that cost gap, or is this going to result in inflationary pressure on a lot of the consumer products that we use with the chips inside them?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think as per the SIA comments, which in the SIA is the industry association that represents some of the semiconductor capital equipment manufacturers, it's effectively cost prohibitive without incremental tax incentives. So I think to the extent that incentives were put in place, it could make a lot of sense. But I would also just take a step back. I think that a lot of what you're reading here is part of a broader chess move. If you just rewind back a week ago, the Department of Commerce put in surprise export restrictions to certain semiconductor manufacturers that are exporting to the China region. So I think when you think about what's going on here, the U.S. government is looking to crack down on China and Huawei in a more meaningful way and bring supply out of the region. And I think all of this is tied into that general theme.
Tim, you got a question?
Yeah, I guess my question is ultimately, does the U.S. stand alone on this? Is this U.S. China, or is this the world against China and Huawei? And are we fighting the world's battle here?
I think it's a great question, Tim. I think two things I would point out. From a U.S. perspective, I think we are, as a country, probably overly reliant, more so on the Asian supply chain than others, just given when you think about Silicon Valley and the likes of some of the larger manufacturers from a semiconductor perspective that I brought up earlier, whether it's NVIDIA, AMD, because Silicon Valley is such a powerhouse of the U.S. and so much of that technology is coming out of the Asian region, it's certainly very U.S. specific. But where I do think there's a common ground is if you think about just the global supply chain and just other countries' motives when they think about Huawei, there's, right now I think the UK is a great example where there's, this goes back up to the prime minister level where Prime Minister of UK has basically gotten into the middle of a fight across both sides of the aisle because there's a lot of disagreement on what's going to happen with Huawei infrastructure in that country. And the U.S. has been putting a lot of pressure on many countries across the planet to effectively drop Huawei out of their architecture. So I think this goes back to the other point that I was making earlier, that I do think that all roads lead to China and Huawei in terms of how the U.S. administration is thinking about pursuing their goals. And when you think about potential export restrictions and what we're doing to effectively try and cut off Huawei, if you remember about a year and a half ago, we added Huawei to the Department of Commerce, added Huawei to the entity list of the country, which effectively prohibited the direct shipment of semiconductors to that company. But despite that, Huawei's still been producing goods. So I think a lot of this is going back to national security policy at the aim of trying to choke off Huawei.
Dan, you got a question?
Yeah, hey, Jared. Is it just semiconductors, or do you have to reorient the entire smartphone, server, and PC supply chain more towards the United States? Because ultimately, these things need to be streamlined the way they have been in Taiwan and China.
Ed, I think that's a great question, Dan. I mean, so if you take a step back, about a week and a half ago, in a surprise move, the Department of Commerce restricted export of many goods on what they call the Commerce Control List. And that list is exhaustive in terms of items that can get shipped to the Chinese military and non-military uses. And it's very exhaustive, everything from the most basic level semiconductor to the most advanced. And it could be as enforceable as the U.S. government wants it to be. And I think it just goes back to the heart of why these plants were built in China to begin with and in the Taiwan region is because the entire supply chain is over there. So I think that when you think about the supply chains that are built out in Asia and bringing them back here to the U.S., it's very complicated. As a recent example, if you think about in the context of the trade war that's been going on, there's been a ton of movement to try and get supply chains built up in India and Vietnam, but the labor wasn't available. And I think you're going to have similar concept back here in the States when you think about the ability to move out these supply chains. And to your point, it's not just about semiconductors. It's about the entire ecosystem that exists outside the U.S. So I think the bigger push to bring the ecosystem back here to the U.S. is certainly a complex one, and it's going to take quite some time.
Jared, great to speak with you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Melissa.
Jared Weisfeld of Jefferies. Guy Adami, putting aside what's good for the country, but just thinking about it from a stock perspective, if you heard the news that Intel was going to go in building a new foundry in the United States, maybe in Texas or somewhere, alongside the U.S. government, is that a good thing for Intel or a bad thing? And what do you think that ultimately means for that whole, that ecosystem would have to, a big chunk of that would have to move to the United States as well?
Yeah, maybe maybe the knee jerk is higher on the stock, but I think in terms of the broader implications, I think it's potentially very negative, not only for Intel, but for our markets. I think people are underestimating. Listen, maybe it's the 100% right thing to do to bring all the manufacturing back to the United States. I'm not an economist. I didn't take political science in college. Maybe it's the right thing to do, but there is a cost associated with that, and I think the market is looking past this in a way that it shouldn't. I think this is far more serious in terms of U.S.-China relations than the whole trade negotiations were 18 or so months ago, and for whatever reason, the market is discounting it. I don't think the market should. I think this is some pretty scary rhetoric that's going on right now.